as I said, lovely. Thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's Lunch and Learn. As you know, it's all about reducing your digital emissions. We will be recording this session, as you know, but I'm really pleased to welcome you to this sort of 45-minute real whistle-stop tour through. So as you will have seen when you registered, what we're going to be talking about today is what digital emissions are, to explore how you might measure those and to measure them effectively for your business, and then some practical ways that you might then reduce those digital emissions. We have a fabulous guest speaker with us today, James Canning, who I'll introduce in a moment. First of all, I just want to do a really quick bit of housekeeping. You'll see that as you're entering that you are on mute. So what we'd love to do though is to really invite you to think about any questions that you might like answered, and to use the Q&A feature to drop those in whilst James is doing his presentation. We have a little bit of time at the end for you to for us to come back to those questions and talk about any sort of key themes that are coming out, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as possible. And quickly before we get into the meat of this, I just want to flag who Heart of the City are. So I know that we've got some familiar faces with us here today, but if you don't know who Heart of the City are, we are a responsible business charity, and we have been working with businesses for about 22 years now, and our role is to support businesses to build, enhance, and then amplify their responsible business practices. So that includes how they connect with their people, how they connect with their local communities, and why we're here today, which is about how do they have a positive impact on the environment around them. So after the session, we will be sharing a recording of the session. So feel free to sit back and enjoy it. You don't have to take lots of notes. And lovely, I'm just going to crack on and introduce you to our guest speaker today. So in a moment, I will get James to come on screen. James Canning is the Chief Sustainability Officer at MSQ. He's also the co-chair of BEMA Sustainability Council, and he has a huge wealth of expertise to talk to us about those tech emissions. So James, I'm going to stop sharing in a second, and if you want to pull up your slides, that would be fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Hopefully, can you see my ones now? Is that looking good? Great. Cool. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm James. And I guess my job is split into really kind of two pillars, and we're going to focus on one of those today. One is on net zero strategy, very much for MSQ, big global digital marketing professional services company, really. And the other strand is very much focusing on, I guess, from an MSQ point of view, our customer proposition. How do we become leaders in environmentally sustainable digital services, technology, and marketing? And so, although there is a connection between your net zero strategy and digital emissions, it's perhaps not as obvious as you might think. The reason to target and reduce your digital emissions isn't necessarily as a driving force behind your net zero strategy, as we'll get into shortly, once you understand the sort of profile of digital emissions, but you need to understand the sort of compelling reasons to tackle them. So, I mean, I think, look, the headline stat, this used to be my, when you do presentations, the rule is you start with some big, big splash. I mean, this has been out there for a while now. Maybe this is news to people. It's often initially surprising that you've got this big headline statistic. The internet has a larger carbon footprint than the airline industry, about 3% of global emissions, and it's rising very, very rapidly at a time when the aviation industry is actually kind of in decline. And we'll get into that shortly, because whilst it's a fun thing to compare in terms of size, it has a hugely different profile, and we'll start to touch on this. The airline industry is 50 million flights a year. It's a tiny number in comparison to the 4.5 billion people who have access to the internet, who make trillions of interactions every year. So it's a very, very different profile, and that has some quite interesting, you need to understand that in terms of trying to find the reason to tackle these things. I am going to talk about, some of the tools to measure digital emissions. I'm going to get I mean, digital, the internet is very specific. I am going to share some broader tools, resources that I've created for measuring all sorts of different digital emissions. I'm going to pick websites and go into some specifics on that. I'm going to talk about video streaming. I'm going to talk about, but most of what I'm talking about is quite applicable to, you know, a much broader range of digital emissions. But before we jump into how you measure them, and I'm going to give you an example of a fun tool to start with that you could use to measure your website emissions. We have to just take a step back. I don't know if this is true, but potentially landing back on the moon is easier than actually accurately measuring the carbon footprint of the internet. It's not all about data centers. In fact, it's only 10 or 20% about data centers. There's a lot of talk about data centers. That's usually because people are talking about AI, they're talking about cyber currency, they're talking about things that have a very high intensity on servers. But actually, again, when you think about those 4.5 trillion interactions, think about loading a web page off Facebook. Okay, that's data that transfers from a server in the US through multiple countries, fiber optic networks, 4G, 5G, bouncing around all over the place, routers, repeaters, all the way to your home. All of that requires electricity. It's really all about the transmission and the electricity required to transfer that data around. And we can measure that. We can measure the amount of data transfer. And I'll talk a little bit about how we convert data into electricity and how we convert electricity into grams of CO2 emissions. But at in every single country that data travels through, that country has a different grid emissions factor. That's just the amount of, effectively, the amount of renewable energy that country produces onto the grid. So are you really going to measure for every single one of those trillions of interactions, the country that the data flows through and the grid emissions factor for each of those countries in order to work out the total emissions for the transfer? Well, nobody's doing that yet. Nobody's close to doing that yet. And even if you did that, it wouldn't be very accurate. Grid emissions factors are the data that you usually get is a 12-month average, right? We know the grid emissions factor in the UK. I'll show you on the next slide. But right now, it's from looking out my window, it's quite sunny, it's quite windy. The UK probably is producing quite a high percentage of its energy from renewables, and on a cold winter's still day when we all put the kettle on, the opposite is true. So are you really going to measure all of this in real time? Nobody's doing that. So when we plug these tools in and we say, oh, our web page, our website is X grams of CO2, we have to appreciate that this isn't the same as measuring the page load speed. This is really early days, really pioneering stuff, lots more tools coming out. And if you use different tools to measure the same thing, you'll get different results because they'll use different methodologies. It's not like measuring page load speed where we have benchmarks and testing. So if we're going to be experts in this, we just have to kind of acknowledge that. So like fun resource number one, if you haven't come across it, websitecarbon.com. Go and look at websitecarbon.com. Super simple. You just put your website in, just put any URL in that you like, a competitor's website, your website, any website you like, and have lots of fun with this. And it will tell you the grams of CO2 that web page has generated. And that will give you some estimates and said, well, for every 10,000 pages, it's like this, it's like that. Now, the way this works, and sorry, this is the only kind of mathsy numbersy bit, right? But just so that we're clear how these things work, so that you can see that these are an approximation. There was multiple bits of research over the years, and this is being refined all the time. This number went down very sharply from 12 months ago from new research, that we can measure the amount of electricity that it takes to transfer a gigabyte of data. 0.8 kilowatt hours of electricity to transfer each gigabyte of data. So we just have to measure the amount of data being transferred for your website. But again, we could apply this to any kind of digital thing because it pretty much all requires data transfer. If we know the amount of data, we can convert that into kilowatt hours. Now, I already mentioned grid emissions factors. These are readily available, and these are the things that turn kilowatt hours of energy into grams of CO2, okay? And the grid emissions factors in every country are different. The way it works to get over that ridiculous complexity that I talked about is that it uses the international average, which is 442 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour generated. So it's a really super simple algorithm, right? It just takes the amount of data being transferred, divides it by 0.8, multiplies it by 442, and it gives you that number. But you have to have that awareness of the methodology. So for example, if you go and use the site now, and your website's in the UK and it's hosted in the UK and you're sat in the UK, so all the data transfer is probably just happening in the UK, that number, the grams of CO2, is probably about double what it actually is, because in the little number underneath there, you can see actually the UK's grid emissions factor is much lower, 233 grams. The UK is much, much better than the average at producing energy onto the grid using renewable sources on average across a 12-month period, right? Again, it just uses those annual averages. It does give you a 10% reduction on that number if it looks up and finds that the data center is on green energy. And what that shows you is, again, as I mentioned, it's not as much about data centers as I think the sort of press would imply. Of course, yes, this is an average for all activity across the web. And of course, there are things that take very little energy on a server but require lots of data transfer, like video streaming. And the opposite is true. There are lots of things that take lots of energy intensity with minimal data transfer. Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, AI processing, okay, but it's an average, and it kind of shows you that it's important to move data centers onto renewable energy, but that doesn't tick the box, and it's kind of obvious when you think about the data transfer. I've got lots of links in here. There's a link there, there's also a link on the site, so you can read a little bit more information about how it works, where that research is from, how they get those numbers. Okay, so this is like an odd slide, and apologies for it saying, would a client bother? I'm often talking to our potential clients about this stuff, but what I mean by this is, why would a company bother, right? Why would anyone bother to focus on their digital emissions? And that sounds obvious, right? We've all got net zero strategies. The internet has a bigger carbon footprint in the airline industry. Surely we should be tackling this front and center as part of our net zero strategy. Well, actually, when you look at the numbers, and again, I'm only looking at websites now, but even when you blow this out to broader digital definitions, this is a client of ours, Vodafone. We build their co.uk website with them, not just us, we're one of a number of suppliers. And approximately, that website, which has around about 1 billion hits a year, it's a busy site, it's 3,500 tons of emissions every year. Right? That's a big number. If you put that into things that people understand, it's over 10 million air miles flown. It would require 50,000 trees to offset it. Whatever. It's a big number, and we could probably act pretty easily to take a big chunk off that. But importantly, it's only 0.025% of Vodafone's nearly 14 billion ton scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So if I went to the chief sustainability officer and said, "Hey, your website is 3,500 tons. I think we could halve it," he's going to laugh me out the room. He's got 20, 30 things to do on his strategy, and mucking about to find fractions of a fraction of a percent isn't one of them. So what's the point? Like, why am I going on about it? Why bother with this? Now, this is a rather bland looking slide, but just to kind of bring it to life a bit, if we take these first 2 points, simplifying a user journey, we know will usually improve conversions. I use an example like Amazon One-Click. Right? We're familiar with Amazon One-Click. It turns 6 steps into 1. Right? Everybody's been chasing after that beautiful, simple customer experience. Okay, and that usually will drive up conversions, remove barriers. And we know also from Amazon, really decades ago, or the last decade, that making things load faster will always improve conversions. There's no evidence to show that things loading slower is ever a good thing. Now, both of those things, very simple user experiences, very fast, lightweight, quick loading pages, which are things that we've been striving for years, are both masterclasses in digital carbon footprint reduction. Just in website, I know I'm being very specific on websites. We've cut down the amount of data transfer, maybe halved it, and even halved it again in this particular example. So we're already doing a lot of these things. We're already optimizing back end, front end, streamlining things, storing less, transferring less. And we're measuring it in terms of cost and performance and conversions, but actually we're not necessarily measuring it in terms of emissions and talking to our consumers about it and telling them, what the impact is, because we know that consumers like to know the impact of what they're doing and the things that they're buying. I call out good old Oatly milk. If you're familiar with that brand, many years they've been, putting on the side of the box, like how many grams of CO2 you might save. And so, this is in quite cold commercial terms. Of course, we all need to do our bit to tackle this bigger carbon footprint. We need to be leaders in our sector. I often talk about, why doesn't Netflix have a green mode? Okay, why does it force us to watch the videos at the highest streaming resolution possibly that it could force down that our TV will take? Why doesn't it have a button, and why doesn't it at the end of the month say, hey, thanks James, here's some shows you might like, thanks for running in green mode, this is how many tons of CO2 you've saved? If they do that, and I suspect it's coming, watch Disney Plus, watch Amazon Prime, watch all the streaming services, watch their sector trip over themselves to catch up and improve and tell consumers about it. So it's also about being a leader, grabbing an opportunity, driving force. It's often your window through to your customers. Just to show you that, this is out there. This is a really extreme example of a website. I'm not suggesting we will jump to this, but this is Organic Basics. You can see it's very low carbon. It tells you the carbon footprint of all the pages, tells you the carbon footprint of sending a help email. It breaks the rules for e-commerce sites. It doesn't give you any images. You just get these little low-res, low-carbon wireframes. You can download them optionally. And this is just, it's not that we should go to this extreme, but it's an example of what's out there, and you need to kind of be aware that this is coming, so that you can be leaders in this, and not necessarily get kind of caught on the back foot. Just before I kind of, I want to just cover off some other bits about videos and advertising, and then some of the kind of mitigations we can do. There is so much, and I have a very limited amount of time. So I wanted to signpost you to a resource that I created with my Beamer Council last year. It's a very simple, low carbon website called The Green Pages. We can share the URL. It's thegreenpages.beamer.co.uk. Here's a screenshot of it. It's very simple. It's a curated set of resources you can give to any digital team, whether they are technical, developers, engineers, whether they're creatives, UX designers, whether they're content people, advertising, media. And we've just pulled together a lot of the tools that are out there. Some of them are articles and helping to raise awareness. This is our measurement section. So you can see you've got website carbon there, link out to that. Underneath that is cabin analytics, which is, again, uses the same methodology as website carbon, but you can kind of stick it on your whole website and get full-on reports about all of your pages instead of doing them one at a time. But we have measurement tools for streaming media, for advertising. I think there's one for Zoom calls, and we're growing that list all the time. So I appreciate I can't cover every part of digital, but here's a resource that we're building out, and just can be a really great one-stop training tool. And a lot of this stuff isn't very tricky. Just before I kind of talk about videos and kind of mitigations, I already talked about the fact that it's got a very different profile, right? And it's important to understand that profile so we don't go steaming in and say, right, so we're trying to hit net zero, we must have a low carbon website, right? That's not necessarily the right priority. It's unlikely to be the right priority. And even your whole digital estate, may not be priority number one with net zero. It certainly isn't for us. It's commuting, it's business travel, it's green energy for the offices, it's our supply chain, it's purchase of professional goods and services. So it has this very different profile. We've called that out. But of course, I can't do a bit about websites or digital without calling out that, of course, sometimes a digital footprint has an offline carbon benefit. Flights never do. The benefit of flying is you can go to places, you can get to meetings, you can go on lovely holidays quickly around the world, lovely benefits. Digital footprint, if you imagine a spectrum, can have a very significant offline carbon benefit. What we're doing right now is a great example. This has a relatively high digital footprint because we're streaming high resolution video of me waving my arms at you in my presentation. But of course, perhaps 3 years ago, we would have all come into a particular event. We would have maybe all made an extra tube journey. I'd have come down from South Lincolnshire, where I am right now, on the train, etc., etc. We know that technologies like this have an amazing impact, positive impact. And at the other end of the spectrum, I would say TikTok, Netflix. I don't mean to be anti those. I'm not. But the benefits are entertainment. There isn't really an offline carbon benefit. You can make an argument that Netflix is lower carbon than going to the cinema, but you have to think about that behavioral change. Just like I would call out, of course, in my example about Amazon being masterclasses in digital carbon footprint reduction, would I stand or sit before you and profess to say that Amazon one-click is being great for the environment? Well, I don't have the data, but anecdotally, I'd say absolutely not, right? Because we're not factoring in the behavioral change that's going on there, the amount of crap that we're buying and having delivered and sending back. So you have to be very mindful of that. So when I'm talking to teams, often creative teams, marketing teams, UXers, people kind of coming up with the concepts for these digital platforms, I think about these three layers. Can we reduce the digital footprint? Because it's the right thing to do. We can tell consumers about it, blah, 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 everything I've kind of been talking about. Two, does this digital thing that we're talking about have offline carbon benefits? Could we measure it? Could we tell our consumers about it? Is it a good thing? And that may or may not be the case. Take Vodafone, for example. Could we work out that purchasing a SIM card through vodafone.co.uk is lower emissions than a typical trip to a Vodafone store buying it? Probably. It might be quite difficult to do. We haven't attempted it, and perhaps it's a poor example, but potentially there are offline benefits of that Vodafone digital platform. So where do you sit on that spectrum, and can you kind of bring that into your customer experience mapping? And thirdly, and finally, can we have digital emissions? This sounds a bit fancy, and it is the third layer. Can these things change based on those grid emissions factors I talked about? It's very easy, and there's a resource on the green pages for you to use an API to programmatically grab real-time grid emissions factors for many countries. They are out there. So an obvious example for this would be like a smart air conditioning system, right? You can imagine how cool that would be, an aircon system that when the grid emissions factors went up to a certain point, it cut off for 15 minutes. We maybe wouldn't notice, or until grid emissions factors dropped, et cetera, et cetera. And that could have a massive impact on both costs, but also on the emissions over a year. But you can apply it to a website. This was one I saw the other day, so I screen grabbed it. This is Octopus Energy. I love Octopus. We use their EV lease hire scheme. We use Octopus Energy. And I was on their site, and down in the bottom corner there, you can see their little Octopus logo guy popped up and said, "Hey there, by the way, carbon emissions from electricity are currently high at the moment, i.e. grid emissions factors are high, but in nice plain English. Your device, I can see you're on a laptop and it's charged over 80%. Like, why don't you unplug it for a few hours, like rather than charging right now?" And I just thought that was so cool. It's a bit gimmicky. I did unplug my laptop and I felt good about myself. I probably plugged it back in that evening and charged up when grid emissions are even worse, or something like that. But you get the idea. There's a spectrum of things you could do. How could you start to bring these into your digital experiences, whether that's a complex B2C B2B web experience, whether it's a smart aircon system, right? There's a whole range of really exciting things that we can do by grabbing hold of them. So I just want to call out, I know this is about advertising, but really it's about video, it's about media, it's about the impact of digital, it's about marketing, and it's just calling out that elephant in the room in a rather extreme way. Again, a bit like that Amazon example. I just want to give you some food for thought. This is all taken, and again, I'll share the link from a wonderful TED Talk from Susan Solitaire, I think that's the correct name, and it's brilliant, making the case about just how bad the advertising industry's been. Here's some sort of just facts to leave you with, but the Advertising Association estimates that the UK ad industry is worth over 20 billion, and it has scope 1 and 2 emissions of 1.1 million tonnes. A company called Purpose Disruptors, you might have heard of, they took an advert, this is a video advert for Audi, and they looked at that, and that Audi generated, it was a very successful advert, a very successful piece of digital marketing, and it generated an extra $1.78 billion for Audi. Now, it's estimated that campaign therefore actually generated an uplift of 5.1 million tonnes of emissions for Audi, nothing to do with the advertising industry, not their responsibility, just marketing in this case. But the point was actually that one piece of advertising, that one piece of digital marketing generated 5 times the amount of emissions from the entire, at least scope 1 and 2 of the entire UK advertising industry. And so what responsibility should that agency take? Now, I appreciate this is about the advertising industry, this is about the agency, but the elephant in the room is for anyone in marketing, for any of us using digital platforms to reach out to our consumers, there's this conflict, of course, and we shouldn't jump on our high horse too quickly to talk about our incredible digital emissions if we're not kind of aware of and this is kind of where your digital emissions and net zero strategy align, how, what is the carbon footprint of your products? What is the offline impact of this digital marketing, if that's what it is? I don't have any answers for that, but I think, you won't see Amazon jumping out to go, hey, our Amazon one-click's incredible for the environment, it's really low carbon, right? They would just get hugely called out on it if they're not also addressing the offline impact of Amazon one-click. And that's really what this is all about. I can see the digital industry and the advertising industry getting very obsessed with talking about digital emissions. It's a hot topic right now. I've seen a recent article about how Toyota reduced the digital emissions for their advertising campaign by 20%. And it's not that that's a bad thing, but that's a rather greenwashy bit of PR that ignores the impact of all of these cars that were being sold. Anyway, you get my point. While I have a captive audience, I promise this is my penultimate slide, so get thinking about some questions. This isn't really anything to do with digital emissions, but of course, if we're going to measure digital emissions and reduce the digital emissions, we can't get them to zero. So just like you can't get your company's emissions to zero right now, what can you do beyond just reducing? And so this is kind of my opportunity that I crowbar into any talk that I do to kind of actually make sure that everybody on the call understands really the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. And apologies if you're really clear on this term, but actually my experience has been that when I question people and ask the majority of people in marketing, digital, do you know the difference between carbon neutral and net zero? They don't. And I forgive them for that. They are ridiculous terms. And the confusion starts because people don't understand offsetting. And that's because offsetting is another awful term. If I could go back in time, I would get rid of the term offsetting and I'd get rid of the word carbon neutral, because offsetting your emissions doesn't offset your emissions, at least not in the way that normal people would assume that to be the case. You get it from this diagram, but there's an analogy because it sounds a bit odd, like to understand it, but I can't see you guys, so I can't ask you if there's any smokers on the call. I don't smoke. Let's assume that I do. Let's assume that I smoke 20 cigarettes a day, and let's assume that one of you came up to me and said, James, I've seen you smoking. It looks really cool. I definitely want to get into smoking. I'm going to start smoking 20 cigarettes tomorrow. And let's say that we could all agree that that was true. That really was going to happen. They really were going to start smoking 20 cigarettes a day. Offsetting is when I pay that person not to smoke. So I'm not anti-offsetting, right? That's a nice thing that I've done. Now, instead of that person doesn't smoke, instead of 40 cigarettes being smoked, there's just my 20 cigarettes. That would help the impact on the health service. We've helped the situation not get worse. Okay, but for me to skip around and say, well, I used to smoke, but now I'm cigarette neutral is ridiculous, right? And if I did that with two of you and then claim to be cigarette negative and make profound kind of claims about my personal health, like, it's ludicrous. That is exactly what offsetting is, and that is exactly what carbon neutral is. Almost all carbon neutrality claims are done with avoidance offsetting. If you look at the schemes, and we do it, we're a carbon negative business, right? Greenwashy term if that's all we do. If you look at offsetting, the majority of offsetting is protecting forests, preventing deforestation, investments in renewable energy all around the world, ethical schemes in developing nations like low emissions cooking stoves. If you think about emissions, digital or otherwise, okay, and the world's ability to sequester them out of the air, you're spending money to stop the situation getting worse. It is absolutely analogous to the smoking analogy and therefore carbon neutral is kind of a ludicrous term. There's nothing neutral about it. There's nothing that means your impact is neutral. There's behavioral science coming out to suggest that, for example, carbon offsetting flights is a bad thing to do. It's not inherently bad, but it potentially drives the wrong behavior. People think that it's okay to fly if I offset because it neutralizes the impact. That absolutely is not the case. So you need to understand about removals, carbon removals. I hate the fact that sometimes these are called removal offsets. So you have traditional avoidance offsets and removal offsets. I tend to refer to offsets and carbon removals, but I don't get to set the terminology. Carbon removals are new technologies, things like direct air capture, biochar, like generally in the first example, hoovering it out of the air. mineralizing it and sinking into mine shafts and hanging on to it for thousands of years, genuinely hoovering it out of the air. It's very expensive, orders of magnitude more expensive, but this is the net. This bit is the net in net zero. Okay, the net in net zero is nothing to do with offsetting. It has to be done with removals. We're starting to front load ours now. But at a general level, that's the fundamental difference. A net zero position in generic terms is that you've either reduced or removed so that the impact is net zero. And it is fundamentally and utterly different to the greenwash term carbon neutral. If you have a carbon neutral product, if you make your digital platform carbon neutral, in my opinion, you're greenwashing, possibly accidentally so, but I would argue that because I don't think most end consumers who you're talking to have any understanding of that and would believe the impact to be neutral of a carbon neutral product, and it's just not true. So important to understand offsetting versus removals. Remember the smoking analogy, if that's one takeaway. If you've learned something there, I would say you're now kind of world experts. Final slide, therefore, is kind of just to bring that together very briefly. Like, what can you do, right, when you're thinking about digital emissions? And I know I haven't kind of given lots of practical, tactical stuff, but there's a broad range of things you can do. It is an extension of your net zero strategy. There's no point singing to the world about your digital emissions if you haven't got your net zero strategy in place. First and foremost, focus on that. Don't worry about digital emissions, but get your net zero strategy going, right? Because you can't tell the world about your digital emissions if you're high carbon everywhere else. And think about the offline activities, whether that's actually, other marketing events. They're much more likely to have a higher impact than the actual digital marketing, the film shoots, the actual product sales, the distribution. It's all kind of connected to that one above. But again, actually, although we're talking about digital emissions, let's not get caught up in them too quickly without forgetting their impact over here. Measure the impact of your digital estate in your campaign. You can do that. Approximately, you can do it very specifically with tools like Website Carbon. There's all sorts of other ways of kind of estimating it on a spend basis, to estimate your kind of emission, different tools to estimate your Office 365 emissions. You can do it. And then first of all, think about how you can reduce it. You always need to think about the reduction piece. And as I've talked about with digital, there's often a big win-win. It's probably cheaper, it's probably faster, it'll probably optimize and run better if you reduce your digital platform, front end, back end, whatever that thing is. But you can't reduce it to zero. So like anything, what can you do? Well, you could use avoidance offsetting, right? It's quite cheap, and you could do carbon neutral. Hey, our website's carbon neutral. Hey, we have, our digital emissions are carbon neutral for our backend servers, for our data center. It's carbon neutral, right? It's not a bad thing. I think you're probably greenwashing if it's all you do. It depends on how you communicate that. You can plant trees. I haven't really talked about planting trees. It's a form of carbon capture. Of course, trees do sequester and capture carbon. It doesn't count as permanent carbon capture because that has to be 1,000 years plus. And trees don't live that long. They get cut down, they burn down, ironically, because of climate change. So it's hard to actually put a number necessarily on the impact. How many trees, where do you plant them, over what time period, what happens at the end of life, that sort of thing. But it's still an important part of our strategy to do it alongside these things. And then finally, of course, think about carbon removals. If you weren't aware of carbon removals, maybe you can start to bring that into your budget. You can see they're between 10 and 100 times the price, so they can be cost prohibitive. That's why most companies can't afford to completely use them to get to a net zero position today. In fact, that's why the SBTi have defined net zero for companies as requiring a 90% reduction. And there's lots of reasons for that, but partially it's because there just isn't enough capacity in the removal system for us to, hoover all of it out, and we have to reduce. But if we can all start to invest and raise awareness in carbon removals, maybe through digital campaigns, then we get investment and those technologies might take off. Oof, I've talked a lot. I hope some of that was kind of useful. I know it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'll stop sharing unless there's specific questions on slides. I'll pull it back up. I don't know if there's any questions. I'll shut up in a second, but by all means, there's lots of people on the call. Please do find me on LinkedIn. Just find my name, connect with me. The guys are going to send some stuff around, but if you don't have time to get your question in, or you think of something, I'm super available. It's my job. I'd love to hear from you and help if I can.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much, James. I could see really the pace of it was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions that I'd just love to
Right.
share with you. And then in about 5 minutes, I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of extra resources that we've got for everyone here on the call. But we had a couple of questions come in. The first from Marguerite, and the question is there a tool that can be used to measure the digital emissions of webinars or online training programs that you know of?
So yes and no. That's a great question. There are some. There might be more. I don't necessarily know about them all. There's certainly one for Zoom. So you could use kind of Zoom and assume that others are similar. They're all going to stream at a similar rate. My fallback, and it's actually really simple to do with that one slide that I gave you with the 0.8 and the whatever. If you can get any data, like any data on the data transmission. So if you were using a particular tool and you knew that the video streaming for one person was streaming at some sort of bit rate. I'm sorry, this ends up getting a bit technical. It's really, if you could say, right, we know that for every hour of video streaming, it's going to be half a gig. That's kind of all you need. Because go, right, if we've got 30 people, we multiply that by 30, and then we use those two numbers on that other slide. I know it sounds a bit complicated, but the fallback is data transfer. If there isn't a tool, and then I say there is one for Zoom, I'm sure there might be others as well. Please have a look on the green pages. You can get an approximation from data transfer. I mean, it's always going to be, you know, different methodologies, plus or minus 25%. Don't overthink it. But that sounded a bit complicated. But if you can just work out, we think there's going to be this amount of data transfer, you can use that methodology, two numbers on the slide.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question was what's the URL for Green Pages? So we will pop that to everyone following the webinar. So not to worry, you will receive all the resources that James has pointed to. Just another couple of ones that came in. Does switching off video during Zoom or Teams, do you know if that makes a difference? And if so, how do we calculate it?
It does. Same answer. You can calculate it. You can work out the data transfer of the video. So you could, you know, as I say, you can use the Zoom tool and work out like how long it would be for an hour, and then that is based on the data transfer. So you can shut the video off and check. I'm actually just developing the world's with a group some open standards for low carbon website development, and so in that's a great example and a brilliant thing to do, and it can be a kind of nice policy that you say hello and wave around and then maybe turn that off, and just, you know, as I say, as an overall company impact, it might not be huge, but it all adds up if we all started to do it. I think we need to see it coming from the vendors as well, like a green mode in Zoom, something to remind us, an option now where I could drop to a lower carbon version, right, would be easy for them to do. So it needs to be pull and push. And then, you know, again, when you're slightly different point, but like videos on a website, number one rule, don't autoplay them. Okay, they're massive, like the video streaming, just don't have your videos autoplay. But actually you have to go a step further than that. If you're rendering a YouTube video, you know, like you might have a recording of this video and it might not autoplay on the page, but actually get your developers to just show an image and don't even load the video until you click on the image. I don't think, you know, this happens. It's not like it streams in the background. So I know it's a different example, but if you with YouTube, even if you haven't chosen to play it, it buffers in and it streams in, and that's so wasteful. Can you imagine how many web pages there are that are just buffering in videos that you're never going to click on, but YouTube's going, well, I'm just going to buffer it so they get a nice experience. So, sorry, slight aside, but that's another kind of great tip I would do on any website.
No, it's really, really helpful, because I think that'd be particularly pertinent to a lot of people on the call today. I've just got two more questions, which are, someone had asked about planting kelp forests rather than planting trees. Is that anything that you come across?
Yeah, wonderful. Again, I'm not, you know, there's loads of great things like kelp forests. I forget the types of trees we plant. I mean, yeah, you know, there's all sorts of wonderful things out in the ocean as well to protect it, to algae, you know, fantastic, you know, lots of great offsetting projects. You just need to make sure they're usually either VCS or gold standard, so that if you're using them to make carbon neutral claims, they have to be VCS or gold standard usually, so i.e. that yes, this investment is the equivalent of stopping a ton. So wonderful. Yeah, you have to be very mindful of tree planting projects that just where the trees are being planted, not being cared for, and you're just ticking a box. So we need to put all this, because there are all those other benefits with that type of project around. It's not just the environment, you know, it's not just carbon sequestration. It's about the environment and improving the biosphere and helping species come back to life. So we need all of that, and they're brilliant. And please don't take this message away, because I once had it that someone had read an article that was sort of talking about what I'm talking about, and someone said, oh, apparently offsetting is a waste of time, a waste of money, and we shouldn't be doing it. It's not. It's absolutely not what I'm saying. Please invest in these projects. They're wonderful projects, but understand the impact and understand what carbon neutral means, and let's help the world sort of re-educate and reorientate around these terms, because they're very misleading.
Brilliant. James, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I think that's an amazing point to sort of end on for your section. So thank you so much. What I'm going to do very quickly, we've just got 3 minutes left. I'm just going to pop up and some additional resources for people in the room. So bear with me a second while I load that for everyone. Right. Lovely. I hope everyone can see that okay. This is just to flag to everyone that we have some upcoming lunch and learns, and James had touched on the fact that there's a lot of information around that offsetting piece and greenwashing piece. James is coming back and joining us for another session on the 27th of September. So please do book yourself on to come to that. And just to flag to you, we've also got one on introversion in the workplace, and also something about accessibility and inclusion as well for SMEs. So we'd love to see you there, and we will send you those links. The next piece is just to flag to everyone here, if you're not already aware, Heart of the City does run 2 programs. We have a course that is very specific around reducing carbon. So SMEs, if you're based in the City of London or you operate significantly in the City of London borough, you do have access to a fully funded, so completely free course to help your business work towards net zero and include all this sort of information around reducing your tech emissions. And we also do host another program called Foundations for Responsible Business, which takes all the learning from the climate course and adds in lots of stuff around how do you work with your people and connect with people, equality, diversity, inclusion, etc. And how do you connect to your local communities and contribute to local regeneration. And that program has fully funded places for certain London boroughs as well. So please do have a look at those, and we'll send you links to those as well. Finally, we kind of really rapidly come to the end of the webinar. So this is just the opportunity to say thank you so much for joining us. I really hope that if you've been sort of eating your lunch, that you've had a chance to kind of sit back and relax and absorb it all before sort of rewatching it, perhaps later this week when we send you the recording. We've also would love to hear from you. Please feel free to email us. You've got our socials on here, and I know James had said to sort of connect with him on LinkedIn. So please do follow that up. So I know he's really keen to sort of kind of a pioneer in this space. So yeah, that's just from us, and thank you so much, everyone, and thank you very much, James.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.